Leave it to Rudolph. It was Christmas Eve in Lapland and snowing hard. Santa and Mrs. Claus were rushing around loading bulging sacks of presents onto Rudolph's sleigh. It was their busiest night of the year and they were running late. It was also Rudolph's second year pulling the sleigh on his own, since he was the fastest. Hurry, hurry, urged Mrs. Claus. It's time for you to leave. Just one more sack to go, answered Santa, huffing and puffing as he staggered towards the sleigh. But the ground was icy. Santa slipped and fell, landing with a crash in the snow. Ouch! He cried. I think I've twisted my ankle. Mrs. Claus helped Santa back into the house and found a bag of frozen peas to put on his swollen ankle. The cold will make it feel better, she explained. Rudolph shook his head sadly. It didn't look as if Santa would be going anywhere in a hurry tonight. His ankle had puffed up like a balloon. He couldn't walk, much less climb up and down chimneys. What are we going to do? Wailed Mrs. Claus. Tomorrow is Christmas Day, and children everywhere must have their presents. You'll have to go instead of me, sighed Santa, clutching his sore ankle. But I don't know where all the children live, replied Mrs. Claus. Leave it to Rudolph, Santa reassured her. He'll know what to do. When Rudolph heard the plan, he shook his head again. His memory wasn't very good, and he didn't have the other reindeer to count on. He wasn't sure he could remember where all the children lived, but Mrs. Claus didn't want to disappoint the children. So she kissed Santa goodbye and climbed into the sleigh. Things went well at first. Rudolph managed to remember where everyone lived, and he showed Mrs. Claus where to go. But then they reached the very last town on their route, the town of Melford. Now, Rudolph, said Mrs. Claus, the first present I have to deliver here is a sparkly ballet dress for Sophie Smith. Do you know which house is hers? Rudolph looked around, feeling puzzled. He had forgotten where anyone lived in Melford. Rudolph had to guess. He pointed a hoof towards a red door in a row of houses. 23 Old Grove Street, asked Mrs. Claus. Rudolph nodded, hoping for the best. From then on, things seemed to go smoothly. Rudolph helped Mrs. Claus deliver a giant fluffy toy rabbit to Harry Bennett at 24 Old Grove Street and a shiny red bike to Emily Brown at number 25. Last of all, Mrs. Claus squeezed down the tiny chimney at 6 Walnut Lane and delivered a pair of silver and blue football boots to Samuel Jones. She even managed not to wake up the puppy that was asleep at the foot of the bed. Then Mrs. Claus and Rudolph headed back to Lapland, feeling very pleased with themselves. When they got home, a relieved Rudolph went to his stable for a well-earned rest, and Mrs. Claus went into the house to see Santa. His ankle was much better. How did it go, he asked. Rudolph remembered everything, even the children in the last town of all, Milford, said Mrs. Claus proudly. Sophie at 23 Old Grove Street got the ballet dress she asked for, and Harry at number 24 got his rabbit. We delivered the bike Emily wanted to number 25 and Samuel's football boots to 6 Walnut Lane. Everything went very well. As Santa listened carefully to what his wife was saying, his eyes grew wider and wider. Then he got up and pulled on his long black boots. Wake up, Rudolph! He called. We're going out again. We have to go back to Melford, explained Santa to Mrs. Claus. Sophie Smith doesn't live at number 23. That's where Samuel Jones lives. Sophie lives at 6 Walnut Lane, and Harry doesn't live at number 24. That's Emily Brown's house. Mrs. Claus looked horrified. Are you saying that everybody got the wrong presents? She stuttered. That's exactly what I'm saying, nodded Santa. Come on, Rudolph, we've got more work to do. When Santa and Rudolph got back to Melford, they could hear a cockerel crowing. It was Christmas morning. Santa shot in and out of chimneys as fast as he could, putting everything right. Luckily, his ankle had made a full recovery. He quickly grabbed the toy rabbit from the end of Harry's bed and rushed over to Emily's house with it. He grabbed the shiny red bike from Emily's house and crept back to Harry's house with it. Then Santa squeezed down the tiny chimney at 6 Walnut Lane and found the football boots that were meant for Samuel. Sophie's puppy was at the foot of the bed, but he didn't stir. Santa wriggled back up the chimney and kept on sorting out the whole messy mix-up. All that was left to deliver was the ballet dress to Sophie at 6 Walnut Lane. Santa squashed himself into the chimney one more time and placed Sophie's present on her bed next to the sleeping puppy. I'm not going back up that tiny chimney again, he thought. I'm running out of time. I'll use the back door instead. But just as he was creeping out, Sophie's puppy ran into the back garden, barking loudly. He wanted to play with Rudolph. Shh, cried Santa. You'll wake up the whole town. But the puppy didn't understand and barked even louder. This time, you can leave it to me, smiled Rudolph, who was standing patiently outside. He lowered his head until he was touching noses with the noisy puppy. Then he said something to the puppy in animal language. Woof, 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 replied the puppy, and he trotted back inside, wagging his tail. Good job, Rudolph, said Santa. You may be a bit forgetful at times, but you've saved Christmas after all. Now let's go home. With one last weary effort, Rudolph leapt into the air, and by the time all the children woke up on Christmas Day, Santa, Rudolph, and the sleigh had completely disappeared. They were all back in Lapland with Mrs. Claus, fast asleep. The end.